I came home expecting to find my farm as I left it, but instead, I found a hotel built right on my land. The HOA decided to turn my property into a resort without my permission, thinking they would profit at my expense. I knew something was wrong the moment I entered the dirt road that led to my farm. Firstly, because the usual silence of the countryside had been replaced by the noise of machinery, voices, and, worst of all, ambient music. Secondly, because right at the entrance, where once there was just a simple fence and a wooden gate, there was now a giant sign with a ridiculous name: Sunflower Springs Retreat and Spa. I stood in the car for a few seconds, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. I had left the city for a few months to sort out a few things and return to a more relaxed country life. And now, my farm had become a hotel. The sign shone in the afternoon sun with a sophisticated logo, elegant font, and the promise of relaxing experiences and immersion in nature. The problem? Nature was mine. Every inch of that land was mine, bought and paid for with the sweat of my labor. And now some lunatic thought he could turn my land into a private resort without even telling me. I got out of the car and walked to the entrance. There was a guardhouse. Yes, a guardhouse. And a man in uniform, probably a security guard hired by some idiot who believed he was managing a legitimate enterprise. He looked at me without even suspecting that I was the owner of the place. "Welcome to Sunflower Springs, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Did I have a reservation? Oh, I did, but it was out of anger. I ignored the question and simply walked past him, leaving the guy confused as I entered the property. Every step made me feel more like exploding. This wasn't my farm anymore, or at least, it didn't look like it. There was an organized parking lot with signs indicating visitors and VIP guests, a lawn decorated with artificial fountains, and even a stone path leading to a building that, as far as I knew, was supposed to be a stable. But it wasn't. The old barn, which I used to store farm equipment, was now a luxurious reception area with large glass windows and polished wooden furniture. Next door, what had once been a space for the horses had become a lounge with white sofas and tables where a few people sipped green juice and chatted as if they were in paradise. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. It was then that the person responsible for this antics appeared, dressed impeccably, with a well-cut blazer and the smile of someone who thinks she'll never face consequences. The woman left the building and came straight towards me, without even imagining the trouble she was about to face. "Hello, are you interested in staying at Sunflower Springs? We're offering promotional packages for new visitors." She spoke with the confidence of someone who thought she had the world under control. The problem was that it was my world. I just crossed my arms, took a deep breath, and looked around, absorbing the level of insanity of the situation. "It's funny," I began, keeping a calm but ironic tone of voice, "because I left here a few months ago leaving a farm, and now I come back to find this." The woman frowned, not understanding. "That? Yes, that," I repeated, pointing to the real estate aberration they had stuck on my property. "Can you tell me who authorized turning my land into a resort?" At that moment, her expression changed. Not much, but enough for me to realize that she finally understood who I was. "Ah, so now it's sunk in? Ah, well, there have been some changes in the local administration, and we decided that this space would be better used as a place of relaxation for the community." Changes in the local administration? I almost laughed. She said it as if a bunch of suits had sat in a room and decided, in a democratic way, that my farm was no longer mine, as if I had signed a contract at some point, as if someone had asked me. But I already had a suspicion of who was behind it. The Residents' Association, the most obnoxious and authoritarian group that ever existed. A bunch of people who believe they can run other people's lives just because they have too much free time, and think that being president of the HOA is the equivalent of being governor of the state. And of course, the woman in front of me was the leader of this aberration. She kept talking, trying to smooth over the situation with stupid explanations about space appreciation, economic potential, and how everyone was very happy with the project. But I wasn't listening anymore, because while she was talking, I was already imagining what would come next. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just any idiot. And before I even left town, I had already done something that was now going to be their undoing. A direct deal with the mayor. A plan that would turn their small victory into a historic defeat. I knew the woman thought she had won. She spoke with that confidence typical of someone who is used to getting away with anything, explaining, as if she were a patient teacher, the benefits that this change brought to the community. Her tone was that of someone who expected me to accept the situation willingly, perhaps even feeling lucky that I was now part of something bigger. But the problem was that I'm not a sucker. I stood there, looking around, absorbing every detail of the disaster they had created. The old cornfield? Now it was a makeshift golf course, with middle-aged guests laughing and taking lazy swings. The pond where my animals used to drink water, transformed into an artificial swimming pool with sun loungers and parasols. Even my old house, the one that stood on the highest part of the land, and from where I used to admire the sunset, was now a secondary structure of the resort. I couldn't believe it. I took a deep breath, pretending to be calm. So, let me get this straight. You just decided that my farm didn't exist anymore and built this fancy dump on my land. The woman smiled, as if my anger was a passing phase. I understand that this change may come as a shock to you, she said, putting a hand to her chest, as if she was really worried. But we guarantee that all the legal procedures have been followed, and that this new facility will bring many economic benefits to the region. Legal procedures. Of course, I was used to this bullshit. It was always the same with people like her. They take an obscure regulation, interpret it in a completely absurd way, and then pretend that what they've done is 100% legitimate. But she had no idea that I was already prepared for this. Before I left town, I already knew that the Residents Association was trying to get its claws into my land. They had already tried to fine me on ridiculous grounds, such as inadequate landscape maintenance, which was basically a fancy way of saying that I didn't want to turn my farm into a magazine garden. But the real warning came when I received a strange document saying that the rural zone where my farm was located could be re-evaluated for other uses. In other words, they were already planning something. That's when I took a simple but ingenious step. I went straight to the mayor. Many people don't know this, but local politicians don't care much about neighborly squabbles. But you know what they do care about? Urban projects that violate environmental and commercial laws. And that's exactly what I brought to him. Did you know that the HOA in my area is trying to turn my farm into a commercial area without going through the city council? I asked, throwing a pile of documents on his desk. He flipped through the papers, initially without much patience, but soon his expression changed, because there, right in the middle of my evidence, were two facts that made the whole thing a bomb about to explode. The HOA didn't have legal permission to touch my land. It was as simple as that. There was no official authorization from the town hall allowing that construction. They just assumed they could do whatever they wanted and went ahead. The area where my farm was located was protected by environmental laws. This meant that any large-scale construction had to pass rigorous ecological impact assessments. And considering that the HOA had literally cut down trees and drained part of the lake to build this aberration, they were completely screwed. The mayor was silent for a few minutes, reading the documents. Then he let out a long sigh and rubbed his temples. Do you realize the size of the problem this could cause? I just smiled. And I have more proof, if you need it. And that's how we got an official warrant to investigate the illegal resort that the HOA had built on my farm. But I didn't want it to be a discreet action. No, I wanted it to be a spectacle. And that's exactly what was about to happen. Back on my property, the woman kept trying to convince me, that this was the best thing for everyone. "Don't you want to be a good member of the community?" she said, feigning disappointment. "You can even have a percentage of the profits." Ah, yes. Now I could have a percentage of what was already mine to begin with. How generous! But before I could reply, a roar of engines caught everyone's attention. On the other side of the property, 3 cars and a truck from the town hall arrived, accompanied by inspectors, lawyers, and a representative from the mayor's office. The guests began to look at each other, confused. The woman's eyes widened, her confidence finally showing signs of cracking. "What is this?" she asked, her voice wavering. I crossed my arms and smiled. "This? Ah, just a little reminder that you can't just steal other people's land and think you'll get away with it." And that's when the chaos began. The inspectors started handing out official embargo documents, stating that any operation there had to be stopped immediately. City Hall staff began inspecting the facilities, noting all the environmental and legal violations. And the guests? Well, they began to realize that perhaps they weren't staying in a legal resort. What happened? A mass exodus of people grabbing their bags and fleeing as if they had just discovered they were sleeping on a nest of snakes. The woman tried to argue, her voice becoming increasingly shrill as she explained that it was all a misunderstanding, that the mayor should reconsider, that the resort was almost ready for the official opening. But no one was listening, because what she didn't know was that I had one last trick up my sleeve. At that moment, one of the inspectors approached her and handed her a piece of paper. She took the document with trembling hands, read it quickly, and her face went pale. This can't be right." "Oh, yes, it is," I said, almost feeling sorry. "Almost. This is an official demolition notice. You know, because all this garbage was built illegally and on private property." She stood there, holding the paper, as the weight of reality finally fell on her shoulders. And best of all, that was only the first part of her punishment. Because after the demolition, there would still be a bill. And I was going to make sure that every penny came out of her pocket, and the damn HOA. The chaos that followed was a spectacle worth watching, with popcorn, guests rushing out, employees trying to figure out if they still had a job, inspectors taking pictures and making notes as if they had stumbled upon a first-rate political scandal. And in the midst of it all, the woman, who until a few minutes ago had been playing the boss of reason, was now pale and trembling as if someone had pulled the rug out from under her. The scene had everything I could ask for. But I wasn't going to stop there. I wanted to see how far she would try to take this clowning around before admitting that she was completely screwed. She was holding the demolition document so tightly that it looked like she was going to rip it in half. Her eyes were darting from side to side, looking for some magical exit, a hole in the ground to crawl into. But there wasn't one. After all, when you build an illegal hotel on someone's farm without permission, without a permit, and without approval from the town hall, the inevitable fate is not success. It's a giant lawsuit followed by a bill saltier than the artificial swimming pool she stuck in the middle of my land. For a moment, it looked like she was going to try to argue with the inspectors, but even she realized that any words at that point would only make things worse. Then, with a pathetic remnant of her former arrogance, she turned to me. "You didn't have to take things so far." I let out a short laugh. "You turned my farm into a luxury resort without my permission, and now you want to make me feel guilty because I followed the law?" She gritted her teeth, but didn't answer. The noise of the inspectors marking out areas for demolition seemed to make her more and more nervous. It was the sound of her money going down the drain. And, oh, how I wish that was all there was to it. But there was more, because it was one thing to dismantle the physical structures. Another thing was the debt that came with it. Just as the guests began to disappear and the staff realized that the party was over, another group of people arrived. Lawyers. Not hers, mine. Yes, because while I wanted to see that hotel dismantled piece by piece, I also wanted to make sure I didn't spend a single penny on it. The HOA, and more specifically the woman standing in front of me, was going to pay for every penny of this shenanigans. The lawyers approached, bringing documents and more documents. I had already anticipated that she would try to evade responsibility, so I made sure that the whole process was sewn up tightly. Well, now that the city council has determined that this is illegal, we have the financial part to deal with, said my lawyer, adjusting his glasses as if he were talking about the weather. We've already filed the lawsuit for the HOA to cover the costs of the removal, as well as compensation for the damage caused to private property. The woman's eyes widened. Compensation? Oh, of course, I said, pretending to be surprised. Did you think you were just going to knock it all down and walk away? I spent months unable to use my own farm, not to mention the damage to the soil, the felled trees, and the drained lake. You must imagine that all this costs money, right? She opened her mouth to speak, but one of the lawyers handed her the papers right in front of her face. We're talking about an estimated six-figure sum to cover everything, not to mention the possible environmental fines that the city may impose. Her face lost even more color. If before she had seemed panicked about losing the hotel, now you could see real fear creeping in. Because it was one thing to lose an enterprise, it was another to lose money. A lot of money. This is absurd, she managed to say, her voice a little choked. The resort was creating jobs, boosting the local economy. Funny, I said, pointing at the inspectors who were finishing labeling the structures. It seems that no one in the town hall agrees with you. What happened next was even more beautiful to watch. The HOA tried desperately to escape responsibility, claiming that the project had been a private initiative and that they had only supported the development of the area. The problem? Her name and the HOA's name were on several documents, signed papers, recorded meetings, even emails exchanged with suppliers. There was no escaping it. And so it was that, as well as losing the illegal hotel, the woman and the entire association were stuck in a financial hole so big that they would probably spend years trying to get out. Me? Well, I finally got my farm back. Of course, not without work. I'd still have to restore the soil, replant some of the destroyed vegetation, and renovate some of the areas that had been derailed by this freak resort. But all that was a small price to pay compared to the pleasure of seeing the HOA and its arrogant leader being crushed by the weight of their own stupidity. And best of all, I made sure that every brick removed, every gram of rubble, was charged directly to them. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing someone try to pull the wool over your eyes and end up hanging themselves with their own rope. If there's a perfect way to end a spectacle of destruction, it's to see the culprits forced to watch from the sidelines, unable to do anything about it. And that's exactly what happened. The woman stood there, paralyzed, watching her empire crumble, literally. The first glass column had already come down, and now the demolition workers were working like a synchronized army, tearing down walls, ripping out structures, reducing the luxurious Sunflower Springs retreat and spa to rubble and dust. The guests had long since disappeared, fleeing before anyone started asking if they knew they were sleeping in an illegal building. The resort staff, poor things, were probably already updating their CVS on LinkedIn. And the woman? Well, she was trying to process the fact that her big dream was being reduced to ruins before her eyes. Ah, but the best was yet to come. Because after destruction came collection. While City Hall staff and inspectors ensured that everything was demolished as it should be, city lawyers began to gather outside, discussing what would come next, who would pay for it all. And the answer was quite simple. I wasn't going to spend a dime. The HOA, on the other hand? Well, I couldn't wait to see their faces when they got the bill. The woman finally caught her breath and tried to counterattack. "This can't be right," she shouted, holding up one of the documents handed over by the inspector. "Does this say that the HOA is responsible for all demolition and compensation costs?" The city attorney, who should be used to people like this by now, didn't even blink. Exactly. Since the HOA approved this construction illegally, without authorization from the owner or the city, you are responsible for all the costs. But that's a fortune. Of course it was. It was the price of thinking you could steal someone's property and turn it into a hotel without asking first, the lawyer continued, without showing a shred of patience for her pathetic attempts at excuses. What's more, as your association was responsible for authorizing these changes, you will also be prosecuted for violating environmental laws and trespassing. The woman began to sweat, and, for the first time, her smile completely disappeared. Because now, as well as seeing everything being destroyed, she also knew that the HOA was about to collapse financially. Think about it. These people already survive on the edge, charging their neighbors ridiculous fees to keep flowers trimmed and sidewalks painted. Now, they were going to have to pay for all the demolition, the environmental damage caused by the construction, legal fines, and, on top of that, compensation for me. And I'd already made a point of hiring a lawyer to make sure that this compensation was very fat. She tried to argue with the lawyer. She tried to say that it wasn't like that there was a misunderstanding, that it was all for the good of the community. Nobody cared, because the only truth there was that she and the HOA had made the mistake of thinking they could play owner of the world. But now, they were about to learn that reality doesn't work like that. The destruction session lasted all day. Every structure they had built without permission was torn down. The fancy parking lot? It became a mud lot. The old barn, which had been transformed into a luxurious reception room, reduced to pieces of wood and broken glass. Even the stone path that led to what used to be my house was destroyed, removing any trace that this absurd resort had once existed. And I watched it all with indescribable satisfaction. When the dust had settled and all that remained was a pile of rubble, the inspectors finally closed the case, making it clear that the HOA had 30 days to start paying the costs or face even worse legal action. The woman stood there, looking at the wreckage, completely defeated. And I, like a good neighbor, decided to offer one last piece of advice. I think the next time you want a hotel, you'd better buy land and build one legally. She didn't reply. She just walked away, defeated, knowing that her reign was over. Over the next few days, the HOA collapsed. Fees skyrocketed to try to cover the absurd debt they had accumulated, but angry residents refused to pay. Complaints against the management began to surface. Investigations were launched, and within a few months, the HOA was officially dissolved. The woman? Well, she lost everything. She was sued by the very HOA members who once idolized her, became the butt of jokes in town, and eventually disappeared without a trace. And what about me? I got my farm back, rebuilt what I needed, and went back to living in peace. No hotel, no guests, no HOA, and with the certainty that sometimes all you need to win is to be one step ahead of the idiots who think they can outsmart you. And if you liked Karen's ending, please comment and like it.